Welcome back to Close Up. New Hampshire had an uphill battle this primary cycle as the DNC moved to strip the state's first-in-the-nation status. But one bigger name in the party, California Representative Ro Khanna, stuck with the Granite State the whole way. He's joining us this morning. And Congressman Khanna, thanks for being here on Close Up.
Adam, great to be back on.
So as someone who came to the state to help out with the write-in campaign, what struck you about what you were seeing on the ground in the days leading up to the election?
What struck me is how seriously New Hampshire voters took their responsibility. Look, it's no secret many were upset with the DNC about the calendar, but they said when you vote for president, it's not just about the DNC calendar, it's who can be the leader of the free world. And they put aside their frustrations to come out for Joe Biden, not just to vote for him, but to organize one of the most impressive grassroots campaigns. And I think that speaks so highly of New Hampshire voters.
Yeah, more votes for President Biden than any sitting Democratic president in a previous primary in the history of the institution. Give us a sense of what some of your fellow Democrats in D.C. are saying about this.
There is a lot of appreciation for New Hampshire. I mean, I think there is a recognition that things could have gone very differently had President Biden not had that strong showing. It would have been an impediment to his campaign. And a lot of people, at least privately, are thanking folks in New Hampshire. I suggested to the president's, one of his former chiefs of staff, that the president should call and thank those who organized that campaign. It was incredible what they did for President Biden.
How do you think the DNC will take this? It's hard to imagine that this struggle over first-in-the-nation status is in any way close to over.
My sense is that they will be appreciative. I mean, look, New Hampshire could have reacted a very different way. People could have said they're going to cast a protest vote. But again, they said there are a lot of issues right now. The war in Ukraine, the war in the Middle East, the economy, and they looked at the totality of it. And in fact, Dean Phillips ran the Bigfoot ad that President Biden wasn't in the state, but ultimately people said he's still the leader, the best leader to be president. And I think there's a lot of appreciation for New Hampshire in D.C.
Why did you want to stick up for this state? You know, a lot of Democrats were ready to just turn the page or weren't willing to come out publicly and say anything positive about New Hampshire. You've really been the only one from wire to wire who's stuck by the side of the Granite State.
Well, part of it is I am a political junkie in terms of history, and I know how seriously people in the state take their responsibility. I love coming out there, hearing people ask questions, whether someone is at 30% in the polls or 1% in the polls. That's the best of democracy, and I just love that tradition. And I always get inspired when I come out there and see pictures of Jimmy Carter carrying his own luggage or some challenger who no one heard of having a chance at a town hall. This is what we need to stand up for. We're a party that believes in democracy. We should honor the democratic traditions like in New Hampshire.
We've spoken before about the diversity argument against New Hampshire's case for staying first. It's clear that New Hampshire is going to follow its state law and continue to uphold its tradition. But do you think that debate over demographics is going to continue in terms of who should have that first-in-the-nation status?
It is, and of course it should be diverse. And I'm going to South Carolina for the president this weekend, and I understand why South Carolina matters. 40% of people who were enslaved came through the port of Charleston. But my view is that you could have New Hampshire, South Carolina, Nevada all in the early primary and work out so it's consistent with state laws. And that's the diversity of the nation. And I hope in the future that the DNC can get there where they recognize the importance of diversity, but that doesn't mean that they have to take something away for a retail tradition that has served the country well.
Let's talk some policy right now. No deal yet on border security and the Ukraine package. It's looking less and less likely. We're seeing some reporting that President Trump is interceding with Republicans and telling them that he essentially wants to run on the issue of the border. You know, Washington is dysfunctional, but it seems like an election year it's going to potentially get even worse.
It has been dysfunctional. It's a shame that President Trump is trying to politicize it. But here's what voters think. They think everyone is to blame. They don't think anyone has done well on the border. They say, why can't you just get together and have a common sense solution? Have security, have more border patrol funding, go after the cartels, make sure there's a legal pathway to immigration. Now, I do believe that the president has put that forward, but we need to build a case for a consensus. What I don't think voters want is just saying, oh, it's all of the Republicans' fault or all the Democrats' fault. I think they blame both sides.
Do you think a deal will get done, or is this something that's just not going to happen this year?
I think it's very hard because it's become so politicized. And the reality is that the Republicans want the issue to run on. But what we need to do as Democrats is make it very clear what we stand for. It should start with, we love the role that immigrants play in America. I'm the son of immigrants. Immigrants are patriotic. They help create business. They work hard. They contribute to this fabric. That's been our tradition as a Democratic Party, from John F. Kennedy to Mario Cuomo to Barack Obama. But we need secure borders, and we want people to come through the right process. And we need more Border Patrol agents. We need to make sure that people's asylum claims are being adjudicated quickly, not in the country for years without going to a hearing. There's a common sense approach here, and I think that's what people want, and we need to make that case and then get a majority for it in the Congress and Senate.
Do you think we'll see this friction here spill over into the ongoing budget negotiations, potentially have a shutdown in March?
I hope we avoid a shutdown. I think Speaker Johnson so far has been willing to stand up to the Freedom Caucus to fund government. It would be tragic if we allow government to shut down. So I'm confident, quite confident, we will get a budget deal. I'm more concerned whether we will get funding for Ukraine. I support that funding. I think it's important for us as the world's greatest superpower and democracy to stand up to Putin's aggression. Even if you believe there has to be a diplomatic solution there, you don't want Putin to march into Donbass, Odessa, and Kiev before you get that diplomatic solution. I do think we need the Ukraine funding.
You've been here in New Hampshire a lot, but you do represent one of the most tech-savvy districts in the entire United States there in California. You know, each new week there's a new story about artificial intelligence, some good, some bad. I'm curious, how far do you think Washington should go in regulating this new frontier to make sure the outcomes are positive for the American people?
We need to do three things. First, we need an AI regulatory agency like the FDA to make sure that the AI is safe. We have that for nuclear technology. We need to make sure it's true for AI technology. Second, we need to make sure young people have the opportunity to learn AI. I've set up a program with Google and Manchester Community College and community colleges across the country to help prepare people for the new technology jobs. I think that is critical. And third, we need to make sure that AI is augmenting people's skills, not replacing them. We're going to actually have a roundtable February 15th in D.C. with leading economists and academics of legislation that can help achieve that.
When you talk about that replacement, what's the future of the labor movement, which Democrats support, and this new frontier of AI, which could really eliminate a lot of jobs?
Well, I was for the UAW strike workers and for the writers, which was a lot of it was over AI. The writers said they need to have control over the AI. They shouldn't just be replaced by AI and then have AI write scripts that would be awful. I mean, unimaginative in Hollywood. And the UAW workers were concerned that AI would be giving profits more to the owners and not to them. So I think workers have to have a seat at the table in using AI to enhance productivity, enhance their income. And a lot of it is, will they have a seat and voice in that debate?
You know, on the campaign trail, we heard former President Trump made a lot of promises here in New Hampshire. One he was saying consistently was he's going to cut energy costs in half in New Hampshire if he becomes president again. You know, how do Democrats compete with a message like that, whether he can make it happen or not?
Well, one of the problems in New Hampshire, as I understand it, is that they haven't gone as much as other New England states to renewable energy. They're still relying too much on natural gas, which costs a lot to ship up to New Hampshire. So the way to cut electricity costs is to have more investment in renewable energy and diversify the energy source and not be as dependent on the Middle East. So I think we have to make our argument for how we're going to lower electricity costs for folks in New Hampshire.
And one of the last questions for you here. One of the more interesting events that happened in New Hampshire in this last cycle was a debate between you and Vivek Ramaswamy at the New Hampshire Institute of Politics there at St. Anselm College. You know, even though you weren't obviously on the trail yourself as a candidate, what was that like, you know, getting a taste of going back and forth with one of the Republican candidates there?
You know, the highest compliment I got on the debate was that I brought out the best in Vivek Ramaswamy. I mean, I don't know if people were saying that he did well or I did well, but here's what I loved about that debate. There were no pot shots. We had significant disagreements. I have a totally different vision for America, but it was a substantive civil discussion. It's actually what I love about New Hampshire, that you can do that. We did that at St. Anselm, and I wish we could do more conversations like that, not just in the presidential season, but around this country in living rooms so that people can disagree respectfully and we can find some common vision for America. That's our democracy at its best.
All right, maybe we'll see you two on another debate stage in the future. Representative Khanna, thanks for taking time with us up here in New Hampshire as always. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Adam.
All right.